Hey class, today we're going to take up chapter 3, pages 79 through 83. And what we're going to look at here in this chapter are what are called argument forms or patterns. Being able to see forms of an argument is important for evaluation of arguments. We've learned, what evaluation is all about. We want to be able to assess an argument to determine whether it's a good or bad argument. We learned the particular evaluative criteria, which is appropriate to an argument depending on what kind it is, right? Deductive or inductive arguments. In this chapter, we're actually going to take up nothing but deductive arguments. So we're going to be working with the concept of validity. We want to know if an argument is valid or invalid, and we're going to be able to make that determination on the basis of the sort of form that an argument exemplifies. That when you see a form, right, of an argument, and you know that it's a valid form, then you can, by virtue of its exemplifying that form, say that it's a valid argument. If it's an invalid argument, then you can say that it's an invalid argument by virtue of the form, right? Whatever the content may be, you don't even need to think about the content, when you see the form. Not all forms work like that, but certain forms, do allow us to make that kind of determination independently of the content altogether. Those, examples of those are going to be given here in this chapter. So one thing you want to do in this chapter is you want to begin distinguishing form from content. This is a very difficult thing for people to do. Because in our everyday lives, we sort of tend to, mingle the two, right? We don't, distinguish form from content. We think of them both at the same time. And actually, we probably give priority to content. When you learn how to distinguish form from content, which is a form of abstraction, by the way, it's a higher level of thinking, and you want to gain, some ability to do this. Recall what I said about, I'm evaluating some of the deductive arguments in the previous sessions. I mentioned, that if you put on your alien hat, you have to abstract from content and just look at the information that's provided in the arguments to determine whether an argument is such that if the information provided in the premises is true, then the conclusion is true, must be true, right? If that was an instance where we're actually abstracting form from content, and in this chapter, we're going to, take this even further and do it, intentionally. So here's a tip for you as you work through this chapter, and a tip, to help you, develop this ability to abstract form from content. You want to think of form like, the variable in mathematics. The same variable can be substituted by many different numbers. X can stand for, any number, right? Whether it be 1, 2, or 3. So in the same way, the same argument form can be substituted by different content. So let's go on. Here's an example that the text begins with of an argument, and then seeing the argument form within the argument. Okay, so if the job is worth doing, then it's worth doing well. The job is worth doing, therefore it's worth doing well. That's an argument, and that argument is an example of this form right here. The form is if P then Q, P therefore Q. So remember I told you these are like variables, right? The P is standing for certain content, which is the job is worth doing. And then Q is standing for other content, which is the job is worth doing well. P is standing for other content, the job is worth doing. And then Q is standing for other content. Same P and Q, right? Same variables. So it's worth doing well. So that's an example of a modus ponens. It's going to be one of the forms that we're going to learn here. And look, here's another way of thinking about this. Yet another analogy, right? This might help you. This may not, right? But you can see sort of the form as being the bone of the argument, and the content as being the flesh, right? So you have this bone right here, and you might dress it with all different kinds of flesh, right? It just happens to be dressed with this flesh here in this form. So this bone is actually, sort of the frame of this argument here. Okay, it's providing the frame for this flesh. So you can use that analogy, the analogy of bone and flesh, rather than variables. Whatever works for you. I'm just trying to provide you with different frames of reference for understanding what the difference between form and content is. And it's going to be very, I mean, if you can sort of, grasp that, and gain a facility with seeing forms and, distinguishing them from their content, that's going to go a long way in helping you to be successful in this course. So I really think it's worth the time to be able to do that. Now, these forms of argument a lot of them are going to have what are called conditional statements. Conditional statements are these if-then statements, right? So it's the first statement here. If the job is worth doing well, then if the job is worth doing, then it's worth doing well. So what is a conditional statement? We have to define that. A conditional statement, is an if-then statement, right? And what you want to do is you want to know what the components of a conditional statement are. So here's an example of one. If professional football incites violence in the home, then we can reconsider giving widespread support, approval to the sport. So now the conditional statement is composed of an antecedent and a consequent. The antecedent is a thing, that it follows the if, right? So you notice here, right? This has this. These are just two different, ways that you can construct an antecedent. So here's the first one, right, where you have the if to begin with, and it's an example. This one here, or this is an example of this structure. If the antecedent, then the consequent. Okay, and what this statement is saying is that, look, if the antecedent is true, then the consequent must be true. Okay, and so when the antecedent is true and the consequent is true, then it's a true conditional statement. The only time that this conditional statement is actually false is when the antecedent is true and the consequent is false, right? So let's take this example here. If I have $100 in my pocket, then I have money in my pocket, right? So it's saying if I have $100 in my pocket, right, that's true. Then if I have money in my pocket, that must be true. Okay. So if it turns out I don't have any money in my pocket, right, and this is true and this is false, then the whole consequent is false. Okay. Let's see. So we're going to actually learn more about conditional statements, about how to determine whether the whole statement is true or false. I'm just sort of providing you, with an introduction now. But we will, when we discuss truth tables later on, we will be able to, think more deeply about conditionals and when they are true and when they are not. Now, another point before we move on is that conditionals, may, be structured differently. The if doesn't always have to come first, right? The if can come, in the middle, and then you don't even need a then in the statement, right? The then is optional, right? It doesn't even need to be there. So we could have taken the then off of this statement, and it would still be the same statement. You would still have, an antecedent after the if, and then the other component is going to be the consequent. Now, there's and you could also do, you can do the then first, and then so that would be the consequent. I'm sorry, not the then, but you do the consequent first, and then then you add the if, and then the antecedent comes after that. So we could restructure that statement up there to say this: we should reconsider. I'm going to just abbreviate some of this so I don't have to do so much writing. Right, we should reconsider giving widespread approval to the sport, to football, right? We would probably say football in that case. if football incites violence, if it incites violence. Okay, and so those are all the same conditional, even though they're structured a little bit differently, right? You still have the same antecedent and the same consequent in all of those differently structured statements, all those versions of the statement. So this is going to be the consequent, and this will be the antecedent. Now you have to remember this terminology. We're going to use this terminology over and over again in the course. So this is a very technical course, right? So that means that you have to learn a new language, essentially, right? That's what technical terminology is, and gain a facility with the terminology, be able to put those concepts into your own words. Okay, that's necessary not only for this class but for all technical training, especially theoretical training. Right, if you're going to do anything that's theoretical, if you're doing something practical, right, that's maybe a different story. Anyways, this structure here, the structure of this conditional is, exemplifies this structure here, and this one up here exemplifies that structure. Okay, so now we know what conditionals are, and as I said, they're going to be in certain of these forms that we learn here. So there's the one that we just looked at there. The very first example earlier was an example of a modus ponens. So notice that here we are starting with the form first, right? So it's defining it in terms of the form. A modus ponens is an argument. Now let's analyze this, okay? Modus ponens in the Latin means affirming the antecedent. Modus ponens is a technical term. They just use a Latin term, right, for to reference this type of argument, which what it does is affirm the antecedent. Now, what does that mean? Look, it means that you have an argument here. We have one conditional as a premise. That's this first one here. And then in the second premise, you have an affirmation of the antecedent, right? The antecedent is the thing that follows the if, remember? So this is the antecedent. And then in the second premise, you have an affirmation of the antecedent. Okay, so when you have those two things on premises, as premises in an argument, then you can go on to infer the conclusion, which is the consequent. Okay. So again, here's a conditional, right? A conditional is one premise. The second premise is an affirmation of the antecedent here. And then as the conclusion, you can bring down as a statement in itself, the consequent. Okay, so here's another way of looking at it, right? Is basically like these two things come united in one statement, right? It's actually a compound statement composed of two statements. And what you're doing, in a modus ponens is you're bringing out, the consequent and making it into a statement on its own. Okay, so so disuniting, it's disuniting the consequent from the conditional and putting it on a separate line, all on its own, right? It's just a separate statement of itself, right? And in order to do that, you need a conditional, right? Where you have the two components together, the antecedent and the consequent, and then you also need, the antecedent, affirmed on a line by itself, and then you can go ahead and bring out, the consequent and put it on a line by itself. So here's an example of it. We saw, the earlier one. Here's another one. So if Ajax steals the money, he will go to jail. Ajax steals the money, therefore Ajax will go to jail. Now, just keep in mind, what some of the points I just made, about the form are going to be applicable to the example, right? Look, Ajax steals the money is the antecedent. Ajax will go to jail is the consequent. Notice there's no then in there, right? That's the consequent. Okay. And then on the second line, you have an affirmation of the antecedent, which is Ajax steals the money. And then you can go ahead and affirm the consequent as the conclusion. He will go to jail, which is up here, right? Okay, so moving on to the next form, we have what's called modus tollens, and this is where you are denying the consequent. So again, you have a conditional affirmed on the first line, if P then Q. On the second line is where you have the denial of the consequent, right? So it's saying not Q. So when you have a conditional and the denial of the consequent as two premises, then you can go on to infer the denial of the antecedent, which is not P. Now it's very important that you get these knots straight, okay, and that you're actually doing what is, described here, denying the consequent. If you were to actually put, a Q here instead of a, let me show you an example of what a fallacy would look like. This is actually another form that we're going to discuss here in just a second. But if you were to put a Q as the second line, on the second line, the second premise, and you have if P, then Q, okay, and then you go on to infer the antecedent. That's not a valid form. Okay, that's not what this is doing here. This is totally different. Okay, so you have these knots make all the difference in the world, right? It changes everything when you include them or remove them. Okay, so this is saying when you have a denial of the consequent on as a premise, and then there's a conditional that it's referencing. Then you can bring the denial of the antecedent down a line by itself as a conclusion. Okay, but you can't do this. Okay, that's actually an invalid form. We're going to learn the invalid form here in just a second. But that would be a mistake. And you have no idea how commonly that mistake is made by students in introductory logic courses. So you want to be very careful with that. Okay, so now here's an example of it. So you have if Ajax steals the money, he will go to jail. Ajax will not go to jail. Therefore, Ajax does not steal the money. So notice you have the conditional, right? And then the second premise is a denial of the consequent, which is he will go to jail. So it says he will not go to jail here. And then you can go on to conclude that he will not steal the money. That you can go on to deny the antecedent. Okay. Okay. So now moving on to a hypothetical syllogism. This is another argument form, and it has actually three conditionals, right? As the premises, two premises and a conclusion. It says if P then Q, if Q then R, if P then R. Okay, so if you have these two premises here, if P then Q, if Q then R, then you can go on to conclude this. Now these are sort of used in causal reasoning all the time, right? So say if you're rich, then you will become sad, right? If you become sad, your life will then be miserable. Therefore, if you're rich, your life will be miserable. That is, an example of, of a hypothetical syllogism which has this form. Okay, so one thing you can notice about if you want to sort of make some more, if you wanted to see a little bit more in the the form here, you notice that there's one variable, right, Q, and then Q is tied to to P in some way, and Q is tied to R here in another way, right? So when you have this form here where Q is an antecedent in one conditional and then the consequent in another, then you can go ahead and just bring this variable down here, the antecedent, right? Notice the antecedent P is going to be down there, and then this will be the consequent over here in this R. So you're going to just drop the Q's, right, and then bring down the other variables, and keep them in whichever slot they were originally in, whether it was antecedent or consequent. So an example: if Ajax steals the money, he will go to jail. If Ajax goes to jail, his family will suffer. Therefore, if Ajax steals the money, his family will suffer. Okay, so again, this is all about form. Okay, you see the same form here. This is, you notice this is Q, right? And this is substituting for Q here, and then this is P, and this is R. Trust me, that's an R. Anyways, let me put it over here a little bit clearer. And then and then P and R end up down here. Okay, and then Q drops off. Okay, so another form is a disjunctive syllogism. A disjunctive statement is an either-or statement, right? So either, here's an example of an argument, I'm sorry, of a statement, right? Either you are 25 or you are rich. Those two things have nothing to do with each other, right? But you can, the disjunctive statement is just fine. Either you're 25 or are rich. Hey, you might be both, right? I mean, so it's not an exclusive, it's not an exclusive sense of or. We're going to learn more about disjunctive statements, later as well. And when we discuss truth tables, there's, exclusive uses of or, like, either you get a salad or you get soup today, one or the other and not both, right? Or either you're 25 or you're 10, right? You're not both. That would be an exclusive sense of or. This is the inclusive sense of or. You can, both of these things can be true. And, we sort of capture that with, grammatically we capture it like this, right? And or, right? So they both might be true or, or one or the other. Okay, so a disjunctive syllogism is going to have a disjunctive statement as one of the premises. And so you see that here, either P or Q, and then it goes on to deny one of the what's called a disjunct, right? Individually, they're called disjuncts, right? So a disjunctive statement has two disjuncts, one on each side. So you have a denial of P, one of the disjuncts, and then you go on and bring down, the other one. It's the only one that's remaining, right? So if P is false, this one is saying, either P or Q is, true. That's what this is essentially affirming. So it's not P. That one's not true. So that means that Q is true, the remainder. So let's look at the example. Either Ralph walked the dog or he stayed home. Ralph didn't walk the dog, therefore he stayed home. So you have the disjunctive statement presenting two alternatives, right? Two alternative statements. And one of them is denied in the second premise, and then the conclusion allows you to bring the remaining statement down in the affirmative, right? You're not denying it, right? So notice again, right? The nots make all the difference in the world, right? If you were to say either P or not Q, not P, therefore not Q, that would be wrong. It would be that would be a mistake. So you have to be very, attuned to these negations. It's sort of interesting because one time I included, this negation in an example in a quiz, and then the student was like, "That's a trick question." No, there's there's no trick question about it, right? I mean, no one is trying to trick you. It's just, the not, is presents a completely different sense to the argument, okay? When it's there as opposed to when it's missing. So you need to be very attuned to that. Okay, now moving on to the fifth argument form, denying the antecedent. Remember that we had, affirming the antecedent, right? That was a modus ponens. Those were all valid forms. By the way, I didn't mention that all of these are valid forms, right? So notice at the top there, the modus ponens is a valid argument form, as is the modus tollens, as is the hypothetical syllogism, as is the disjunctive syllogism. So whenever you see those forms of argument, by virtue of the argument having that form, you can go on to say that it is valid. Now we have two invalid argument forms that we're going to take up here. Firstly is denying the antecedent. And this is where you have a conditional as one premise, and then the second premise is a denial of the antecedent. Okay, and then you go on to conclude the denial of the consequent. Okay, well that's not correct. That's an invalid argument form. You'll get an argument, where the premises can be true, but yet the conclusion can be false. That's what an invalid argument is defined as. So, for example, if Einstein invented the steam engine, then he's a great scientist. Einstein did not invent the steam engine, therefore he's not a great scientist. So, so when this, so see if we can analyze this. Einstein, if Einstein invented the steam engine, then he's a great scientist, right? That might be true. Suppose it were true, right? Let's just say that condition was true, and it would be true, right? It would be great. Anybody who's able to, invent the steam engine is a great scientist, right? Einstein didn't invent the steam engine. That's true. We know that's true, and therefore, he's not a great scientist, right? So, the problem here is that you can't. This form, tells us that we can't deny the antecedent and then go on to infer the denial of the consequent, because you get the wrong result, right? It's just not a true. This is not a true conclusion. It's false, even though the premises are true. So, that's why it's an invalid argument form, because remember the definition of validity again. Recall the definition of validity that we learned earlier, which is that a valid argument is one where if the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. And what do you have here? Where you have an argument where the premises are true and yet the conclusion is false. Okay, so that makes it an invalid argument. And whenever you have this form, right, you're that form is going to be invalid, because it's going to lead to this wrong result. Okay. Okay, so affirming the consequent. This is the last one here. This is where you have a conditional as one premise, and then you have the consequent as the second premise. It's an affirmation of the consequent. Okay, and so then you go on to conclude an affirmation of the antecedent. Again, this is an invalid argument form, because when you actually do that, you may get a conclusion that is false, and even where the premises are true, right? But a valid argument tells you that you have to have a true conclusion necessarily, right? If you have true premises, right? In order for the argument to be valid. So if Buffalo is the capital of New York, Buffalo is in New York. Buffalo is in New York. Therefore, Buffalo is the capital of New York. These two premises can both be true, and yet the conclusion is false, right? Buffalo isn't the capital of New York. It's Albany, I believe. Okay, so now to summarize here, these are the 6 argument forms, and I present them in this table here because I wanted to point something out to you, that these 2 argument forms are, very related. Okay, so, in the modus ponens, you're affirming the antecedent, and in the invalid form, you're denying the antecedent. Okay, so this one has, you could say that modus ponens has, sort of an invalid, correlative, right? Or something like that. So, and it's another related form, where you're doing, the opposite of what's done in this one. And then in modus tollens, where you're denying the consequent, there's an invalid form that does the opposite, right? It affirms the consequent. And so, if you keep that in mind, it'll help you to remember it. It's a sort of mnemonic device, right? So now you have 4 argument forms, right? And there's 2 of them, that you can learn, right? And then there are 2 opposites, right? That'll help you to memorize it. And then you have hypothetical syllogism and disjunctive syllogism, right? Which have forms that are distinctive. Okay, and just have to be remembered in their own right. Okay, so now I'm going to walk you through just a couple of homework examples. I want you to see what you have for homework. We have 3.5 and 3.6 in this one here, and so I'll walk you through a couple start ones. So for 3.5, you're going to look at an argument, and you're going to determine whether it's valid or invalid. And all you're going to do is basically look for the argument pattern, identify the argument pattern, and then on the basis of the argument pattern, indicate whether it's valid or invalid. Right? So you had the 4 valid forms, and you had the 2 invalid forms, as we just saw on the table. Right. So for this first one here, let's have a look. So you have, if the Pilgrims built that wall, there would be archaeological evidence of that. There is no such evidence. So the Pilgrims did not build that wall. Now this has a conditional in it, right? So it's going to be one of those four forms that has a conditional in it. And then what you have in the second premise is a denial of the consequent, right? And then in the conclusion, you have a denial of the antecedent, right? That's a modus ponens, right? I'm sorry, not a modus ponens, but a modus tollens, which denies the consequent. That's a valid form, right? So you would, you know, the answer to this would be it would be a modus ponens, and it would be valid. Okay. Let's look at number 6. If CNN News omits important news stories, then it is irresponsible. It is not irresponsible, so it does not omit important news stories. So it looks like we have the same thing again. You know what? And sorry, this actually should be modus tollens. Modus tollens, right? So, and you have a modus tollens here as well, which is a denial of the consequent, right, in the second line, and a conditional in the first line, and then you want to infer the denial of the antecedent, so it's valid. Okay, so you're going to do that for all those in 3.5. Now 3.6, you're going to take a conditional, a given conditional, and then you're going to construct a modus ponens and a modus tollens out of that conditional. Okay, so remember that you know, so in terms of form, right? If you have a modus ponens, right? You have let me do it this way here. I'm going to give you you know, the first premise, right? If P then Q. Okay, and then the modus ponens, what you're going to do is you're going to affirm the antecedent. So the second premise is going to be a P, and then the conclusion is going to be a Q, right? And then in modus tollens, there's going to be a denial of the consequence. So it's going to be not Q, and then the conclusion is going to be not P. Okay, so that's the forms. You're going to present those. You're not going to present the forms themselves, but you're going to present examples of the form, and you're given the antecedent here. So, you know, for this one here, you would take the conditional. If Lino is telling the truth, he will admit to all charges. When you're constructing the modus ponens for that, the second premise is going to be Lino is telling the truth, and the conclusion is going to be Lino will admit to all charges. And there, you're done, right? Those are your three statements, two premises and a conclusion. And then for modus tollens, you're going to take the conditional, and then you're going to provide a denial of the consequent as the second premise. So that would be he will not admit to all charges. And then the conclusion, Lino is not telling the truth. And then you're done with that. So you have to do that. You have to present two arguments for each of these, okay? All right, so that's it for this session. I hope it helped out, and we'll see you next time.